The night never announced his arrival. It only felt different when he was near, as if the air itself paused to listen. And in that uneasy silence, a question always floated unanswered. Was fear born in darkness, or did darkness learn from fear? Long before newspapers would give him a name, before investigators chased patterns like shadows, he was just a quiet child growing up in Rochester, New York. He lived in a neighborhood where streetlights flickered like uncertain thoughts, and houses stood close enough to share secrets through thin walls. His childhood unfolded without obvious cruelty, yet it was filled with a strange emotional distance, the kind that doesn't scream for attention, but slowly shapes a person from the inside. As a boy, he was observant to the point of discomfort, noticing details others ignored, listening more than speaking. He watched people the way some children watch clouds, searching for meaning in shapes and movements. He was raised in a household that valued discipline over warmth and routine over conversation. Questions were met with silence, and emotions were considered distractions. In that quiet environment, he learned early that order felt safer than chaos, and patterns were more comforting than uncertainty. And names, especially letters, held an unusual power. Letters were predictable, unchanging, and loyal in a world where people often were not. At school, he wasn't bullied, nor was he popular. He existed in that narrow space between attention and invisibility, performing well academically without ever shining brightly enough to be noticed. His teachers described him as focused, reserved, and methodical, words that sounded positive yet hinted at something missing. While other children formed friendships and memories, he formed routines. He walked the same routes home, sat in the same classroom seats, and arranged his books in alphabetical order, not because he was told to, but because it felt right. A always led to B, and B always promised C a sequence that never betrayed him. He became fascinated by how a single letter could change a word's meaning entirely, how order could be rearranged to create confusion, and how confusion could make people so uncomfortable. His education progressed quietly, almost invisibly. Guidance counselors predicted a stable, if unremarkable, future for him, perhaps in clerical work or data management, anything that rewarded consistency over creativity. He accepted these expectations without resistance, because ambition was never his motivation. Control was. And control didn't require applause, only structure. He pursued studies that aligned with his need for order, focusing on administrative systems and record-keeping, subjects that transformed messy human behavior into clean lines and files. During these years, something subtle began to shift internally. He started noticing the emotional weight people attached to their names, how a name could define identity, destiny, memory, and loss. And he saw that the alphabet itself was the foundation upon which all those identities were built. By the time he entered the workforce, his life appeared perfectly ordinary. He held jobs that required attention to detail and rewarded precision, working in offices where paperwork spoke louder than voices. He lived alone in modest, sparsely furnished apartments. His lifestyle reflected his internal world, clean, controlled, and minimal, free of both physical and emotional clutter. Those who interacted with him described him as polite but distant, helpful but forgettable. Anonymity, once a childhood circumstance, became a deliberate shield. It allowed him to observe society from the outside, watching how people celebrated, mourned, and formed attachments, all while he remained untouched and unconnected. He grew increasingly convinced that randomness was just a lie people told themselves to feel safe. It was during this period that his fascination with patterns deepened into something darker, yet still disturbingly calm. He began methodically collecting information, names, dates, locations, and letters. He saw significance where others saw coincidence, and in his private thoughts, he began testing ideas. At first, they were harmless, like matching names with places or initials with addresses. He discovered how easily the mind could be led to believe in destiny simply by aligning symbols. When a name and a location shared the same initial, it felt intentional, meaningful, inevitable. That sense of inevitability became intoxicating. As years passed, this internal logic hardened into belief, and belief into purpose. Outwardly, nothing changed. His career advanced modestly, his lifestyle remained simple, and his days were structured around routines so precise they bordered on ritual. But beneath this disciplined surface grew a quiet resentment, not toward individuals, but toward unpredictability itself. In that resentment, the alphabet became more than a tool. It became a language of control, a way to impose meaning onto an indifferent universe. The crimes, when they eventually occurred, would shock the nation not for their brutality, but for their eerie symbolism. Violence was never his interest, recognition was. But at this early stage, no one saw the warning signs because there were none that fit familiar profiles. There was no explosive anger, no history of aggression, no cries for attention. There was only a man living quietly, working steadily, and thinking deeply about order in a disordered world. When the first whispers of the alphabet killer reached the public years later, investigators would comb through his past, searching for a moment when something snapped. But they would find only silence, routine, and a child who learned early that patterns felt safer than people. They would find a man who believed that if life insisted on chaos, then someone had to organize it letter by letter, name by name, until meaning emerged from randomness, even if that meaning came at a cost no one else yet understood. The first time the pattern revealed itself, no one noticed. Patterns rarely shout. They whisper, and only those already listening can hear them. On a quiet morning in Rochester, a tragedy struck. On the surface, it seemed painfully ordinary, another sad statistic. But somewhere in the city, one man saw something others didn't. A subtle alignment of letters. It felt less like a coincidence and more like confirmation. To him, it wasn't about what happened, but how perfectly the symbols aligned. The name, the place, the sequence. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle he'd been assembling silently for years. While authorities treated it as an isolated event, he felt the universe responding, acknowledging his internal logic. The idea was no longer theoretical. It was proven. He didn't celebrate or panic. Instead, he refined. Refinement was his strength. After work, he'd spend hours reviewing notes. No one had ever seen pages filled not with plans, but with observations. Letters circled, initials connected, timelines mapped by sequences, not dates. He was convinced that meaning only existed when order was applied, and that order, once discovered, demanded to be continued. As more tragedies occurred over time, separated by months, sometimes years, the pattern became harder to ignore. Names began to mirror locations, initials echoed across reports, and coincidence stretched itself thin. Yet the man at the center of it all remained invisible, calmly watching as newspapers debated randomness, while his certainty grew stronger with each new alignment. His lifestyle was almost unsettlingly normal. While fear slowly crept into the community, his days remained predictable. Quiet mornings, structured evenings, a spotless apartment. His coworkers saw him as reliable, unremarkable, someone who followed rules precisely and never drew attention. They didn't realize that precision itself was the warning sign they couldn't read. To him, rules weren't restrictions. They were reassurance. And the alphabet was the purest rule system ever created, finite, orderly, and endlessly repeatable. As investigators began quietly sharing concerns about potential connections, he listened from a distance, absorbing every public statement with intellectual curiosity, fascinated by how close they came without ever truly seeing him. They searched for anger, revenge, or compulsion. He operated from belief. And belief doesn't look like madness when it's calm, structured, and patient. In his mind, he wasn't creating chaos, he was revealing it. Eventually, the media gave the phenomenon a name, the alphabet killer. Ironically, names were what he valued most, but he found the title crude, incomplete. It focused on outcomes, not intention. Still, he paid attention. Naming something gives it power, and power invites scrutiny. And scrutiny meant the system was working. People were finally being forced to confront the idea that patterns could exist without mercy. As fear spread, he adapted subtly, tightening his discipline, ensuring nothing in his routine broke the illusion of normalcy. Predictability was his greatest protection, and he was predictable in all the ways that never mattered. His thoughts, however, grew heavier, more philosophical. Was he discovering order or imposing it? Did patterns exist independently, or did they require an observer to give them life? These questions didn't trouble him. They energized him. The pressure on investigators intensified. Behavioral analysts debated motive, creating profiles filled with contradictions. Was he impulsive or obsessive? None of them captured the quiet certainty that drove him. He didn't feel compelled, he felt chosen. Not by fate, but by logic. He continued living between moments of attention, blending into crowds, standing in grocery lines, nodding politely at strangers who had no idea how close they stood to the mind behind the mystery. His invisibility was earned through years of restraint. But even in his discipline, intellectual cracks began to form. He sensed that once a pattern is recognized, it loses its purity. Observation changes behavior. Would the system collapse under scrutiny? By now, the alphabet killer was more than a headline. It was a symbol of fear rooted in uncertainty, in the terrifying idea that tragedy might follow rules no one could understand. As authorities closed in on theories and suspects, none of which pointed to him, he felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not fear, but anticipation. Every system reaches its conclusion. Every sequence arrives at its final letter. He knew, deep down, that his own ending was approaching, not as punishment, but as completion. Because a pattern left unfinished is meaningless, and meaning, above all else, demanded closure. By the time the city began to feel like it was holding its breath, the pattern had already outgrown the man who believed he controlled it. Because patterns, once revealed, develop a life of their own. This realization arrived quietly one evening as he stood by his apartment window, watching the glow of streetlights blur into the dark. He sensed, for the first time, that the system he trusted might be observing him as carefully as he observed it. And that subtle shift, from observer to potential subject, unsettled him. Not emotionally, but intellectually. Uncertainty had always been his enemy, and now it hovered close, shaped like doubt, shaped like the possibility that meaning did not belong exclusively to him. The investigation intensified, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through slow accumulation, as if the city itself was assembling a puzzle from fragments of fear, reports, and whispered connections. No one spoke his name, yet the space around him felt narrower. This wasn't because he was a suspect, but because awareness itself had sharpened, and awareness disrupts the purity of coincidence. He noticed this change in small ways, in the tone of news anchors, in the cautious questions from coworkers, in the way people began to look at names, places, and letters with an unease that mirrored his own fascination. This troubled him deeply. The alphabet was not meant to frighten. It was meant to explain. At work, his famous precision became a liability. Supervisors praised his accuracy, but questioned his rigidity. They suggested flexibility, collaboration, adaptability, words that felt foreign and vaguely threatening. Flexibility introduced variables, and variables weakened systems. He responded by retreating further into himself, maintaining a professional front while internally reviewing his notes, reevaluating alignments, searching for reassurance that the logic still held. Yet the more he reviewed, the more he noticed something unsettling. Patterns were emerging that he hadn't planned, forming independently of his intent. He was forced to confront a possibility he had long avoided. Perhaps he wasn't creating order, but merely participating in it. The media's obsession grew louder, dissecting every detail, Experts spoke about human behavior, randomness, and our psychological need to find meaning in chaos. He listened closely, not offended but intrigued. For the first time, the world seemed to echo his own internal dialogue. But as these conversations entered the public consciousness, something essential was lost, a silence in which meaning thrived. He feared exposure would corrupt the system, turning something precise into a spectacle. Meanwhile, investigators quietly shifted their focus, not toward suspects, but toward understanding the logic itself. They were mapping connections, charting initials, and reconstructing timelines, unknowingly mirroring his own methods. That parallel unsettled him more than discovery ever could. Imitation blurred authorship, and authorship mattered. If the pattern could exist without him, then what was his role? This question lingered longer than any fear of arrest, because it threatened the very foundation of his identity. His lifestyle, once a fortress of routine, began to feel fragile. Small disruptions, an unexpected phone call, a missed train triggered disproportionate internal responses. Not panic, but recalculation. He compensated by imposing stricter rules on himself, reorganizing his environment repeatedly, alphabetizing items that had already been alphabetized. He checked locks not for safety, but for symmetry, trying to restore a sense of control that felt increasingly theoretical. In public spaces, glances lingered longer, conversations paused when he approached. Not because he was suspected, but because fear had taught people to be cautious of everyone. This universal suspicion troubled him. It meant the pattern had escaped its intended boundary, infecting society with the very uncertainty he sought to contain. Late at night, he reflected on his childhood with new perspective, recognizing how early experiences shaped his relationship with order, how silence taught him to listen, how structure taught him safety, and how the alphabet became a refuge from emotional unpredictability. He considered that his belief system might not be universal truth, but personal necessity. This realization didn't inspire remorse, only clarity. And clarity was always his goal. As authorities discussed the possibility that the pattern might end on its own, he felt an unexpected urgency. Not to continue, but to conclude. Unfinished sequences haunted him more than exposure. Every meaningful structure required closure, a final letter that completed the word. This contemplation consumed him. He weighed the ethics not of action, but of completion. Would stopping voluntarily invalidate the pattern or preserve it? Could absence be as meaningful as presence? Was the truest expression of control not continuation, but restraint? These questions, once abstract, now pressed heavily against his certainty, reshaping it into something more fragile, more human. By the time winter approached, he had reached a decision, not born of fear, not forced by law, but shaped by logic. A pattern that demands infinite continuation ceases to be a pattern. It becomes noise, and noise was the very thing he sought to eliminate. So he prepared not for escape, not for confession, but for stillness. He understood at last that meaning does not always require action. Sometimes it requires silence. As he watched the world speculate, analyze, and fear, he realized that the greatest control he could exercise was knowing when to stop, even if the world never understood why. It arrived with a question, one so quiet it was almost missed. What happens to a pattern when the person who believes in it finally lets go? This question held the final chapter of a story that was never really about actions or outcomes, but about the very nature of meaning itself. As the city held its breath, waiting for answers, the man at the heart of the mystery, the one they called the alphabet killer, began a deliberate fade into the background. He didn't vanish in a dramatic flare, didn't flee or confess. Instead, he simply withdrew. He reduced his routines rather than intensifying them, loosening the rigid sequences that once commanded his days. He allowed a little disorder to seep in, to exist without his immediate correction. He was testing a theory. Would the world collapse without his invisible hand guiding it? To his surprise, it did not. Life just continued, messy and inconsistent, yet undeniably, vibrantly alive. And this realization, this simple truth, unsettled him more than any police investigation ever could. The authorities, facing immense public pressure, eventually reached a quiet impasse. They publicly acknowledged that while the patterns were undeniable, proving intent was another matter entirely. The evidence was there, but the motive, the mind behind it, remained elusive. As the media's relentless spotlight slowly shifted to the next big story, the city's collective fear softened into a lingering unease, and that unease eventually faded into a kind of urban legend. The case left behind a trail of unanswered questions instead of a neat resolution. In that vacuum of certainty, the alphabet killer transformed. He was no longer a tangible threat, but a theory, a symbol debated in criminology classes and dissected in late-night documentaries. He became an endless conversation with no conclusion. This shift from a physical presence to an abstract concept perfectly mirrored the man's own internal journey. He came to see that his identity had become inseparable from the idea he represented. And ideas, once they're released into the world, can't be taken back or controlled. His life in the aftermath wasn't a punishment, nor was it a reward. It was a quiet, lifelong reckoning. He continued working his ordinary job, continued existing in the hum of daily life, blending back into the anonymous crowd, but something fundamental inside him had shifted. The absolute certainty that once anchored his entire existence had dissolved into a profound understanding. It wasn't regret, and it wasn't an apology. It was just clarity. He finally accepted that his obsession with order, his need to find patterns, had been a desperate response to fear, not a revelation of some higher truth. He saw how easily that fear, when disguised as cold, hard logic, could convince even the most rational mind that it was acting reasonably. This understanding didn't absolve him, nor did it condemn him. It simply existed, a heavy and undeniable weight he would carry forever. In quiet moments, alone in his small apartment, he would pull out his old notes one last time. He didn't look at them to refine his theories or analyze the data. He just observed them. He saw them now not as proof of destiny, but as the sad evidence of a mind searching desperately for stability in a world that never promised it. He noticed how easily he had assigned meaning where there was none, how effortlessly he had mistaken simple coincidence for grand design. He understood how dangerous it is to confuse recognizing a pattern with having authority over it. Just because you can see it doesn't mean you own it. Just because you believe in order doesn't give you the right to impose it on others. This realization, though it came far too late, carried a moral weight that no judge or jury could ever impose. The city, too, learned its own lessons, quieter but just as profound. Parents, teachers, and investigators all reflected on how the fear had spread. It wasn't because of what happened, but because of what couldn't be explained. They learned that uncertainty digs into the soul much deeper than any clear and present danger. It showed them that human beings will search for meaning, even in pure randomness, sometimes inventing it from thin air just to feel a sense of control. Meaning offers comfort, even when the meaning itself is terrifying. In this way, the alphabet killer left behind a legacy far more complex than just another unsolved case file. He exposed the fragile, razor-thin boundary between logic and obsession, between careful analysis and all-consuming fixation. As the years passed, his name never officially revealed, never fully erased from the files, faded from public memory. But the idea of him lived on. It would resurface whenever a coincidence seemed just a little too perfect, whenever a set of initials aligned a little too neatly, whenever that little voice in the back of the mind whispered that chance couldn't possibly explain what had just occurred. In those fleeting moments, people felt a flicker of the same unease he once felt. They felt the temptation to believe that there's a hidden order bubbling just beneath the surface of chaos, waiting for someone clever enough to uncover it. And in that shared human impulse, his true reflection appeared, not as a monster, but as a mirror, showing us a part of ourselves we'd rather not see. He grew old quietly, living a life that had been stripped of its grand illusions. He understood at last that control was never about arranging the world to fit his vision. It was about accepting the world's stubborn refusal to be arranged. And though the question of his guilt lingered, unresolved, in the public imagination, within himself, the verdict was clear. Not because he felt judged by others, but because he finally understood the true cost of believing that meaning could be engineered without consequence. That silent understanding became his final sentence. And so, the story ends. Not with certainty, but with a warning, whispered instead of shouted. The most dangerous patterns aren't the ones we see out in the world. They're the ones we construct inside our own minds. The ones we convince ourselves are truth. The ones we justify with our own brand of logic. The ones we follow until they shape our every action, our deepest fears, and our very identities. The moral of the story hangs there, suspended in that uneasy space between order and chaos. When we chase meaning too aggressively, we risk becoming slaves to the very patterns we believe we control. Sometimes the alphabet doesn't spell out destiny. Sometimes it just spells out a simple reminder that not everything has to be understood, named, or put in order just to exist. The case may be closed, but crimology never sleeps. Like and subscribe to join Crimology and step deeper into the dark with us.